Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. We have learned how we can use the findViewById function to have reference to our views and use our views within our classes and interact with the views, as well as the view binding feature, which simplifies interacting with the views. Now it's time to learn about the data binding. So data binding is pretty similar to the view binding. It offers the same functionality and the same features that the view binding offers us. It's actually older than the view binding. Now, in addition to all the features we saw with the view binding, the data binding allows your views to observe or listen to changes on the data that they are consuming. And once that happens, the value within the views changes automatically. So say for example, you have some variable within your class called number, and you have a view within your layout that consume this variable and display it to the user. Now, whenever you perform your calculations and operations on this variable, the view that is consuming this variable will change its value automatically. So whenever the value changes, it will just take the new value and display the new value to the user. Moreover, with data binding, you can write the logic and the event handling code in the layout itself. So instead of just setting on click listeners for the views within your main activity class, you could set the click listener on the layout itself. And instead of the if-else statements within your class, you can write the logic directly within the layout. Now before that, I want you to be familiar with our layout for today. So we have this simple layout here, just two buttons to increment and decrement the value. And we have this text view to display the value. And finally, we have this message text view that is just shown to the user once the user reaches 10, which is the end of the counting, or 0, which is the start of the counting. And one thing to note here is the text view is by default invisible. And I'm using here the tools visibility to make it only visible at the design time. Now let's go to the main activity and see our code to be familiar with the code. So this whole layout and the code was made with the view binding, and we will integrate the data binding by learning how we convert from the view binding to the data binding. So as you can see here, we have a variable called number, and we are using this variable to increment and decrement the value. And then we are adding some functionality to our two buttons. So the first button here, which is the increment button, we are checking first if the number is less than 0. And if this is the case, then we are incrementing the number by 1. And then we are changing the result TV text to the new value, which is this text right here, or this text view right here. And we are making the message TV, which is the text in red, to invisible if it was visible. So normally you can change the visibility of a view by just using is visible and set it to false. And in this case, you don't care if the view is gone or invisible. You only care if the view is shown to the user or not shown. However, if you want to be specific about the visibility value of a view, you can change it by accessing the visibility attribute, which is the same from our layout. And here you can set it to the values that we are also used to from the view class. So we have here invisible, we have visible, and we finally have gone. But in this case, we only care if the view is shown to the user or not, so we're using the isVisible attribute. Now, if the number is not less than 10, then we are moving to the else block here. In this case, we are changing the message TV text to the endpoint, which is the text in red. And finally, we are making it visible. Now moving to the decrement button. The logic here is similar, but it's just acting if the number is greater than 0. And if we press on the decrement button, and if the number is greater than 0, then we are decrementing it by 1. And then we are changing the result TV value or result TV text to the new value. And finally, we are making the message TV to invisible if it was visible. And if this is not the case, then we are moving to the else block and just making the message TV text, which is the text in red, to the start point, and we are making it visible. Now let's just run the application to see how it functions. You can see here is our layout. We press decrement and we reach 10. You can see the endpoint. If you are between 10 and 0, you can see that the message TV is not shown. And if we reach to 0 and we try to decrement, the start point text view is shown here. Now let's integrate the data binding feature. So the steps are pretty similar to the view binding. All you have to do is just go to the build.gradle module file, and here instead of the view binding, we are going to change it to the data binding, and make sure it's set enabled. Now click on sync now and wait for our project to finish syncing. Now once it is done, we're going back to the main activity to see what changes the data binding did to our code. And you can see that the data binding doesn't suddenly create the class for us because there's a final step that we have to make in order to generate this class. So we go to the activity main XML file here. Now we have to change the root or the parent layout to a tag called layout. So we have a shortcut for this, Alt Enter, and convert the layout to data binding layout. Similarly, you could just press right click, show context actions, and choose the first option. And you can see here it just made the layout here as the parent of our layout and made our actual layout as a child to that layout, and just added this data tag here. So for now, let's just delete these data tags and talk about the layout tag here. So the layout tag here is just a wrapper layout for our actual layout and just required to use the data binding. Now let's just go back to our main activity to see if the class is generated. And you can see everything works as before. Nothing is going wrong. Now let's see how we can use the data binding. So the first step, you have to determine your variables, the changing variables within your layout. So we said that we are using this number or the number variable here to show the value of the counter. So this is the first thing, we only have a single variable. So how we can make this text view here listen to changes to this value here or to this number variable here? Well, we have to go to our main activity, and here we have to define our data or the changing variables with the data tag. So the data tag is used to define the data that is used in the layout. And here it can contain the variables and the imports that we're using within our layout. So for now, let's just add the variable. And now this variable tag is used to define the variables that can be used to reference the data in our layout. So we said that we have a number variable of the type int. So I'm just going to call it the counter here. And then we're going to specify the type of this counter to integer. And now instead of just giving the value of this text view to 0, we're going to make it to the counter that we have defined. And this is by adding the @ sign, then the curly braces here. And within the curly braces here, you add your variable, which is the counter that we made. Now going back to our main activity class, and here we have to tell the layout or attach this number to the counter that we made within our layout. And this is by using the binding dot counter. And you can see if you press Ctrl and left click, it points to the counter that we created. And here we're going to assign it to our variable or our number variable, number. Now instead of just changing the text value of the result TV, we're going to instead changing the counter value to the new value of that number. Similarly, in the decrement button here, change it to the new value of the number. And now before running our application, we have to convert this counter number here within our text view to a string. So if you give an integer value to a text view, the text view thinks that you are referencing something within the string resources here, because every resource here is referenced to as a number. So instead of that, let's just convert this number here to a string with toString method. We can see that the data binding allows us to use the Kotlin or Java code within these braces here. Now running our application to test the changes, and you can see here our application is just running as before. Counts to 10, shows the endpoint text view, counts to 0, shows the start point text view. Now let's create a variable within our layout that is responsible for showing the message here. So we are setting the message of the text view to start point and to end point. Instead, let's just make our layout do this for us. So here, I'm going to create a new variable. It's going to be the message, and it's going to be of type string. So always make sure that you type the type here, similar to the Kotlin type. So we have an integer. This is how we have an integer value within Kotlin. And here we have a string. So now going to the message text here, and instead of the message, we are going to make it at curly braces and the message. Now let's go to our main activities to make the changes. And here we have to make, instead of this line here, we are going to make it binding.message, which is our message that we created, which is the variable here. And similarly for this one here, binding.message. And now let's run the application to test the changes. Now let's try to, for example, decrement. You can see the start point is shown. Increment, the end point is also shown. So we have said before that we can write the logic for the views within the layout itself instead within the main activity class. So you can see here we are changing the visibility of the message TV multiple times within our code. And instead of doing this, we could simply do it within our layout. And now comes the new tag that we are going to use, which is the import tag. So the import tag is used to import classes that you will use within your layout to write logic. So for example, here we need the view class to write our logic or write our conditions to show the view or hide the view. So for this, we are just going to add the import class. Make sure you are within the data tags. And the view class comes from the Android view package and the view class here. So make sure finally that you close the import tag. Now going to the view that we are changing the visibility. And here, instead just of using the value directly, we will use the ternary operator from Java to add our condition. So if you're not coming from Java, if you don't have experience with Java, if you have no experience with the ternary operator, the ternary operator is simply just like the if-else block that we are used to. However, whatever you write before the question mark is considered to be the condition, and what you have after the question mark is considered to be the code that is executed if the condition is true, and what you have after the colon mark is considered to be the code to be executed if the condition is false. So here what we want to add is to add the visibility or to show this text view if the value of the counter is 0 or 10. So to do this, well, again, we'll have to use the @ sign just like before. So anything that you use within the data binding, then you have to use the @ sign and the curly braces. And here we're going to add our conditions. So the first thing is that we want the counter, which is our variable within our layout, to be equal to 0, or the counter to be equal to 10. And make sure to add these two conditions within parentheses. Then we have to add the ternary operator. Here, whatever we write here is considered to be the code to be executed once this condition is met. So we want to make the view from the view class is visible from the view class. And you can see here just using the view from the view class that we imported here. Now, if this is not the case, then we're going to use the colon, and then we're going to say that this view should be invisible. Now again, let's just revise the code together. This is the condition if the counter is equal to 0 or the counter is equal to 10. If this is true, then we're going to make it visible. If this is false, then we're going to make it invisible. Now let's go back to our main activity and delete everything that is related to the visibility of the message TV. This line, and these two lines. Finally, let's just run the application to test the changes. Now you can see here, this is our layout. If we increment to 10, the view is visible. If we decrement to 0, then the view is also visible and the text is also changing dynamically and automatically. You can see it just similar to the old code. So we are setting the counter here after incrementing. We are setting the value here if this case is not true. So how we can make the view now listen to changes from our data. For this, we're going to use the observable class that comes with the data binding. So instead of just making this number here as an integer, we're going to make it as an observable integer that the views can observe, can listen to. Whatever changes happen to this value of this view, then the view can automatically adapt the new value and display it to the user. So here, instead of making integer, we are going to make it observable integer. And here we are going to set the initial value of this observable to 0. And you can see here we have an error because the counter here is set to be an integer rather than an observable integer. So we have to set the type here to the observable integer. And here we have to give the full qualified name for this observable that comes from the data binding. So just copy this over under X data binding observable int and paste it here instead of this type. Now let's go to see what other errors that we have. You can see we cannot perform our conditions to the number because the number here is not an int anymore. So for this, we have to get the value of this number by using the get, which gets the number from the observable int class here. And then for incrementing, we have to then set number.set the old value of the number.get plus 1. Similarly for the decrement button here, number.get less than 0. And here, number.set number.get minus 1. Now if you go back to our layout, you can see that the counter here doesn't have something called toString because the counter now is of type observable int. So for this, we're going to use the string class dot value of the counter. So the string class here will convert the counter or the value of this counter to a string. And now we have to delete these two lines here because we are just changing the counter value to these two numbers. So our view now is observing the new value. Our view now is listening to changes to the view value. So we don't have to set the counter value again and again because the view is already listening to the changes happening to our observable int here. Now let's just run the application to test all the changes. And you can see here the application works as before. However, we got rid of a lot of lines of code, but there's something wrong here because I set this less than 0. I have to make it greater than 0 to decrement the value. See here the increment works and the decrement works as well. So we would also like the text in red, which is the start and end point text, to be also listening to the changes happening to the counter and change its text accordingly rather than having to change it within the else blocks here. So for this, let's just delete the else blocks from this code and go to the activity main XML file. And within the text here, we will write our condition. So we want to make the text to be start point if the value is 0, otherwise we'll make it end point. So here, if the counter equals 0, then make the text start point. If this is not true, then make the text end point. And you can see we cannot directly use strings within the view binding tags or the curly braces here. And for this, you have two options. The first one is to use a string resource. So I have already prepared two strings resources for this. The start one is start point, the end one is the end point. So come here and instead of just writing your text, refer to the string resource start. And for this one, refer to the string resource end, and it will work. Alternatively, you could just use your strings again, but instead of just making the double quotation here for the value, make it only single quotation for the value, and then you're going to have to add the double for your strings within the condition, and it will also work. Now let's just run the application and check the changes. You can see here we are at 0, so the text view text is going to be start point. If we increment and reach to something here, the text is changed to endpoint, but we cannot see it because the visibility is invisible. If we just reach to 10, you can see it's endpoint. If we again reach to 0, it's start point. Lastly, let's see how we can use functions with the data binding. But before that, I will show you how we used to add functionality to views before using the set onClick listener. So before, we used to add the onClick method or onClick attribute here to the view and then refer to some function we have within our main activity. So currently we don't have any function within our main activity. For this, I'm going to create a function that have both of these functionality. I'm going to call it fun or function process. And in order to be able to call this function from your views, you have to also pass a view within your arguments list here. And now we will check if this view, so we will add the onClick attribute for both of these buttons, and we'll add the same function for both of these buttons. So once it's clicked, I want to first check if the view.id equals the r.id.increment button. If this is the case, then I'm going to call this piece of code. If this is not the case, then the button that we clicked on is the decrement button, and in this case I want to have this functionality here. And for now I'm just going to delete the onClick listeners for both of these buttons. And what we have here is the number, so the number is only within the scope of the onCreate, so we'll have to make it a global variable. So let's just change it to val, because we're not going to change it, and let's make it a global variable just underneath the binding. And now you can see we can access it from our function. Now if you go back to our views, you can see that the function appears here in the list process. Just copy this over and paste it to the other button and run the application to test our functionality. You can see it just works as before, increment and decrement. Now let's see how we can use the functions with the view binding. So again, use the same attribute. However, as we have said, that anything that has connection with the data binding, we have to add the @ sign and the curly braces, and then comes the arrow, and just after the arrow you add your code. But in this case we are not using the argument, so we are just going to delete it, and here we are just going to add our functionality. So if adding some complex functionality within the onClick attribute directly, it will not work. However, it just fixed to some functions call, some classes call, and so on. So for example, if you try to call the counter and try to get the value and try to increment the value, it will not work, as this functionality is considered to be not suitable for the lambda function of this onClick attribute. So instead of this, we will create another variable that points to our class, which is the main activity class, and the main activity class will have the functions that will be added to these two buttons right here. So I'm just gonna create a variable. I'm gonna call it functions, and here the value of the function is going to be our main activity class. So we have to give the full qualified name, com.astroScouting.myFirstProject.mainActivity. If you don't find the full qualified name, it's just the package name of your application, which is this one, com.astroScouting.myFirstProject, and then comes the name of your class. So now moving here, we will call the function, which is called process. Now you can see that we have to pass a view, so you can just pass your view here. But in this case, I'm not going to use this view. I'm just going to create a separate function for both of these buttons. The first one is going to be increment. I don't need the view here for now because I'm not passing any views. I don't want also to check the IDs of the views. I'll delete the else block here. I'll just check if the number is less than 10. Now for the decrement, decrement. Now for the decrement, I'll pass the code for the decrement and go back to our main activity. I'll call the increment function, and for the decrement, here is the decrement function, and for the increment, I will call the increment function. You can see we have both onClick. Let's delete one of them. And now we'll have to also refer to the binding.functions that we created, and in this case we need the main activity, so we can pass this because this here refers to the main activity. Now let's run and test the changes. You can see here the increment works, the decrement works as well. So we have seen how we can use the onClick with the process function. So why do we need the data binding to handle the process of calling the functions from the onClick, as the process was doing the job? Well, the onClick normally have only access to the functions within your main activity class. So we have this layout here, which is the activity main XML, and it's connected to our main activity class. So whatever functions that we have here, whatever public functions that we have here, then the onClick will have access to that functions. So if you, for example, want to call a function which is not within your main activity class or not within the class that is responsible for this layout, then in this case you would use the data binding and just create a variable and the type of the class that has your functions, and then finally you'll call the functions from your onClick. Eventually, view binding and data binding are similar in their functionality, as they provide type safety and null safety over find view by ID. However, view binding was found to be faster than the data binding in most cases, as it simplifies the process of interacting with views and creating the generated class. However, you could use the data binding to bind data directly to your views within your layout instead of your class. And you can see here in these two pictures how we reduce a lot of code within our class from the view binding to the data binding. However, I highly suggest you to use the view binding in most cases, unless you have some use case that we want to bind data to your views directly. So that was it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.